Hi, I'm Christian Pierce, racial and ethnic equity expert at the Competent Center for Diversity and Inclusion at the University of St. Gallen. And welcome to Deep Dives with the CCDI. Deep Dives are online sessions offered by the Competent Center of Diversity and Inclusion from the University of St. Gallen. And these online sessions focus on important D&I topics, specifically from a Swiss perspective. Today's talk kicks off the deep dives for 2022 and is titled Racism in Switzerland, the Reality of the Problem. For today's talk, I will be the overall moderator and am joined by Nicole Niederman, my colleague from the CCDI. Nicole will be moderating your comments and questions on LinkedIn. So feel free at any time to go ahead and write any thoughts, comments, or questions you may have, although we will get to the questions later on in today's session. For our talk today, we have the privilege to have two phenomenal activists, Yvonne, Appio, Brando, Amolo, and Hans Fassler. Hi, Nicole. Would you like to say hello to everyone?
Hello. Many thanks, Christian, for this nice introduction. Very excited to be here and looking forward to, some very insightful talks by Yvonne and Hans.
Thanks, Nicole. With that said, I'll go ahead and introduce Yvonne. Yvonne is a certified United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights person of African descent anti-discrimination expert. She's best known for her femme artivism, which involves using mixed media like Swiss yodel, sculpture, video, and visual arts to challenge societal identity politics. Between 2014 and 2019, her short film, Not Swiss Made, about racism in Switzerland won 18 prizes globally, starting off with the Art Laguna Video Art and Performance Prize in Venice, Italy. She also started a vlog, African Descent, after launching the United Nations initiative, the International Decade for People of African Descent in Switzerland. Last year, she co-curated an art projection for Monster 21, commemorating the 50th anniversary of women's federal right to vote in Switzerland. Currently working on an interdisciplinary PhD on politics, gender, diversity, and virtual reality at the University of Maastricht, Ms. Brando Amolo is one of the jurors of the OHCHR Minority Artist Contest and an elected member of the Swiss Parliament for the Social Democratic Party. Good afternoon and welcome to today's session, Yvonne.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for the invite.
You're welcome. It's a pleasure to have you and a privilege to hear your words later on. With that said, I'll go ahead and introduce Hans Fassler as well. Hans is a political activist who has devoted himself to the fields of slavery, post-colonial studies, reparations, and anti-Black racism, both as a journalist and a public speaker. He incorporates historical research results into current political discourse and vice versa. In the context of the debate on Switzerland as a colonial society without colonies, which began towards the end of the 1990s, he has launched numerous political initiatives at federal, cantonal, and municipal levels. Political journeys took him all over the world, to Haiti, to France, and in 2007 and 2008 to Senegal. In 2005 and 2008 to French Guiana, and in 2019 to Antigua. Also in the spring of 2019, he started to offer guided tours on the traces of racism and on race war and class war in St. Gallen. I've had the opportunity to go on one of those tours. If you yourself are in St. Gallen or in Switzerland, highly recommend making time to see one of those. And he has also been instrumental in exposing Swiss natural scientist Louis Agassiz through his project Demounting Louis Agassiz and exposing that history there. So Hans, great to have you today, and thank you very much for your time.
Hello, everybody, and thanks, Christian and Nicole, for having me in this CCDI event.
Awesome. So, given that Hans will first discuss the historical perspective regarding Switzerland, colonialism, and slavery, he's going to first go. And then afterwards, we're going to transition and shift, and Yvonne will discuss more current issues. Today's session will feature each speaker, and on concluding their discussions, we will have that Q&A period. Like I said, though the questions will only be answered during the Q&A, feel free to type them at any time, and Nicole will be collecting them throughout the session. With that said, let's take this deep dive together. In January of 2022, the United Nations Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent, spent 10 days traveling Switzerland on a fact-finding trip. The purpose of this trip was to see the treatment and respect of human rights of people of African descent in the country. The group noted racism and discrimination at almost every level of education and a lack of acknowledgement of Switzerland's ties to colonialism and slavery. Racial profiling does occur, in addition, unfortunately, to violence from the police. And as we reflect on the 2-year anniversary of the brutal murder of George Floyd, though many people saw the Black Lives Matter movement as something that might be perceived as an American issue, we know that racism was an issue in Switzerland long before the working group's findings. So with that said, I want to start off today's session by asking Hans, what is Switzerland's legacy of racism and discrimination, and why must we discuss this?
Thanks, Christian, for your introduction. Allow me to introduce myself again in another way. I'm an old, white, Swiss, cisgender, heterosexual, middle-class male. So practically, I have all the privileges you can have on this planet. And this is my motivation to give some of this back to those who were not as lucky as I am. I have actually nothing to say on experiencing everyday racism, discrimination, racial profiling, etc. But I can only express my solidarity with those who suffer from it. That story is for the members of the BIPOC community to tell. You will soon hear my comrade Yvonne on that. But it is for all of us to fight it together and to eradicate it until, to use the words of Bob Marley, the color of a man's skin is of no more importance than the color of his eyes. One preliminary remark. I have a slight and polite disagreement with the description of today's panel. The UN group apparently noted a lack of acknowledgement of Switzerland's ties to colonialism and slavery. Now, of course, it depends what a lack means. If a lack means none, there is no acknowledgement, I would, as I said, slightly and politely disagree. I think over the last 20 years, acknowledgement of those ties has increased considerably. If by a lack of acknowledgement you mean that it's not enough, I will perfectly agree with it. Maybe it's a question of age, maybe it's the prerogative and the advantage of old age to see that things have changed in the last 20 years, but of course, activists of a younger generation will focus more on the things that are still lacking. I'm going to present today very briefly 5 case studies, 5 examples, 5 stories of what I call institutional or ideological racism. The 5 cases are Haiti, the Swiss Academy of Sciences, reparations, Switzerland's self-image, and the Swiss government and slavery. Case 1, Haiti. You may or may not know that Haiti was a Spanish colony from its discovery in 1492. It then was a French colony from 1697 It was the richest colony in the world. Then in 1791, a slave rebellion or a slave revolution or a war of independence began, and Haiti freed itself and became the first black free nation in the world in 1804. In 1825, French warships sailed into the Bay of Port-au-Prince, and the then president, Boyer, had to sign a contract at guns point or at cannons point because they threatened to bombard Port-au-Prince. And he had to sign a contract over the debt of independence, as it was called, but basically it was a ransom payment. Haiti was extorted. In 2003, Aristide, then the president of Haiti, demanded restitution, as it was said in Creole. I was in Haiti then, and he demanded that France pay back those 90 million gold francs that Haiti had paid all through the 19th century and had continued to pay because they had been indebted to French and American banks in the 20th century. It is one of the grossest injustices in the modern world. The Swiss government was asked in 2006 in a private member's question whether they were willing to support Haiti in its campaign for the restitution of those 90 million gold francs. The Swiss government first said Switzerland has been and is always ready and willing to mediate between African states and former colonial powers. But they said the question of the restitution of those 90 million extorted from Haiti was a bilateral matter between those two countries. You have to know that Switzerland profited from Haitian slavery. There were Swiss plantation owners on Saint-Domingue, today's Haiti. Swiss people traded with colonial goods. Swiss mercenary soldiers were at the service of the French in order to keep the slaves down, to suppress slave rebellions. So that was case number one, Haiti. No black person has been manhandled by the police. No person of color discriminated against for a job. No indigenous woman insulted by a seemingly thoughtless remark. But the suffering of millions of black Haitians over several centuries and the conflict between Haiti and France, Switzerland said, is none of our business. If that is not racism, then what else? Case 2, the Swiss Academy of Sciences. In 2007, we demanded of the Swiss Academy of Sciences to rename Agassiz Promontory on the Moon, a lunar landmark. The IAU, the International Astronomical Union, refused. They said Agassiz is being honored for his scientific work, for all of his controversial statements. He was not a criminal. He was never accused of participating in the horrors of any Nazi equivalent regime, nor was he ever tried to convict for war crimes. To refuse to name a feature after him because of his politics would open the door to making political judgments of other scientists, which is beyond the scope of the IAU. So Agassiz's pioneering thinking, which was important as far as the Nazi racial hygienists, is just called politics, as if it was the difference between Die Mitte and the FDP, or between Democrats and Republicans in America. But crimes against humanity are not politics. The Swiss National Membership Organization of the IAU is the Swiss Academy of Sciences, of which Agassiz was a member. They ignored this case of the Agassiz Promontory for years. They had to be pushed and pushed and pushed. Later, they said if a demand were addressed to the IAU, we would support it, but we will not become active ourselves. They were pushed and pushed and pushed again. Finally, in 2020, they asked the IAU to rename the promontory. Good. 1 point for the Swiss Academy of Sciences. The IAU refused again. They said Agassiz should be judged by the moral standards of his time. Agassiz's statements were totally unacceptable now, but they had been only marginally so when he made them in the 19th century. In other words, for the IAU, it was okay and common and widespread to hold racist views in the 1850s and the 1860s, which, and I'm saying this as a historian, quite frankly, is absolutely ridiculous and just wrong. And then the Swiss Academy of Sciences said the IAU has dealt with the matter in an appropriate way. The business is finished for us. The matter is closed. That was case 2, the Swiss Academy of Sciences. No person of color has been stopped and searched by the police. No indigenous person discriminated against for a flat. No black child insulted by a seemingly innocent question. But the suffering of millions of enslaved blacks has been presented as normal and acceptable at a certain time. If that is not racism, then what else? Case 3, reparations. You will all remember the summer of Black Lives Matter 2020. There was a debate over reparations. There was an article in Sonntagsblick in which I spoke for reparations by Switzerland. There were 300 comments. And interestingly enough, Switzerland's share in slavery was not doubted at all, but reparations were flatly denied by most of the commentators. They said, this is all too long ago, always Switzerland, we're always to blame. They said, no use, reparations are no use. Look what happened to all our development aid, millions for Africa. They were just squandered and they ended nowhere. But they said the descendants of those patrician families have to pay, which I'm strictly against because we are not following the principle of kinship liability. The Swiss government was asked several times by questions which private members submitted if they were willing to address and repair slavery. The Swiss government answered no or evaded the issue. The Bernese government, the Regierungsrat des Kantons Bern, was asked in 2020 if reparations were something that they would take into consideration. The question was, in view of the fact that the acceptance for reparations for slavery has been considerably growing recently, both in the USA and in Europe, is the government of the Canton of Bern willing to look into the matter of slavery reparations by the Canton of Bern as the legal successor of the City and Republic of Bern of the 17th to the 19th centuries. And this City and Republic of Bern, I add, also profited from slavery. The answer came in 2021 and said there is no legal foundation for reparation payments. But Switzerland did pay reparation or compensation for the so-called victims of child slavery, die Verdingkinder, where children were sold to farmers from 1800 to 1960. Switzerland did pay reparations or compensation to the victims of an organization called Children of the Country Road, Kinder der Landstraße, which until the 1960s took away the children of Jenisch families in order to destroy the culture of the Swiss nomadic itinerant people. And Switzerland did pay reparations or compensation to many of the 60,000 victims of what was called administrative coercive measures, Zwangsmaßnahmen oder administrative Versorgung, which until the 1980s meant locking up maladjusted people, and I put maladjusted into inverted commas, in institutions without due process of law. That was case 3, reparations. No black person has died in a police stop and search operation. No woman of color has been discriminated against for medical treatment. No indigenous teenager insulted by a seemingly innocent look. But the pleas by millions of black descendants of millions of enslaved blacks for slavery reparations has been brushed aside by saying, sorry, too long ago, and sorry, no court has jurisdiction, and sorry, no law applies, and sorry, too complicated. But we, Switzerland, we will make reparation payments to white Swiss victims of gross injustices. If that is not racism, then what else? Case number 4, Switzerland's self-image. Markus Somm, for those of you who don't know him, he was the editor-in-chief of the Basler Zeitung. He is now the editor-in-chief of Nebelspalter. He is a representative of the NPC right, the nationalistic, patriotic, conservative right in Switzerland. And in 2021, published a study why Switzerland has become rich. The book is called Warum die Schweiz reich geworden ist. It was basically recycling his doctoral thesis, and the book asks a very good and interesting question. Why is Switzerland so rich? Some time ago, I read an advert for Die Republik, Switzerland's biggest progressive online newspaper. It said, if you want to get rich, don't try work. It reminded me of my father, who said, how can somebody earn $1 million in a year? And he said, you cannot earn $1 million, you just get $1 million. So basically, his argument was, and my argument is, and this may sound a bit provocative in a St. Gallen University context, if you are very, very rich, your wealth goes back to criminal activities, stealing, you have inherited it, you have exploited other people. And I would argue it's the same with countries. Markus Somm's answer was none of that. It was Protestantism, it was hardworking Swiss people, it was the performance principle, it was immigrants from Italy and France, but who very quickly became Swiss. It was federalism, it was democracy, it was meritocracy, it was brave and creative entrepreneurs. But it was not slavery, he argued, and he wrote a few chapters on that. And it was not the banking secrecy. But most historians would argue Swiss industrialization was based on the textile sector, and from the second half of the 18th and through the 19th century, textiles meant cotton, and cotton meant slavery. Somm simply uses a trick. He says that when cotton became the dominant driving force of capitalism worldwide, especially in the USA and Britain, and very much so in Switzerland, Switzerland was already rich. That was case 4, Switzerland's self-image. No person of color has been interrogated in a police station. No politician of color discriminated against by the media. No indigenous person insulted by a seemingly innocent email. But the contributions of millions of enslaved cotton plantation workers to Swiss wealth has been defined out of modern history by a cheap trick of chronology. If that is not racism, then what else? Finally, case number 5, the Swiss government and slavery. In 1864, a Swiss MP, Member of Parliament from Schaffhausen, by the name of Wilhelm Joos, asked the Swiss government what they wanted to do about Swiss people who owned slaves in Brazil. The Swiss government asked Johann Jakob von Tschudi from a Glarus patrician family to write a report, and then presented this report as his answer, or as their answer, to Swiss Parliament. The report and the Swiss government said slavery was an act that did not involve a crime. It was beneficial and expedient. It was natural for Swiss landowners in Brazil to own slaves. To abolish slavery would mean depriving the Swiss slave owners in Brazil, I quote, of part of their legitimately acquired property, end of quote. And this, according to the Federal Council of 1864, I quote, is contrary to our concepts of morality and justice, unquote. In 2018, a member of parliament from St. Gallen, Claudia Friedl, asked the Swiss government about this position. The Swiss government said this position was according to the norms of the 1860s on slavery. Now that answer is a scandal that is so big that it has been overlooked so far, because we sometimes don't overlook things that are too small, but we overlook things that are too big. So the Swiss government said slavery in the 1860s was okay because those were the norms of the 1860s. In 2021, we asked another member of parliament, Franziska Riesow from St. Gallen, again to ask the Swiss government about this scandalous position. The Swiss government answered in exactly the same words. They were the norms of the 1860s. For about a year, we have been trying to interest the media in this scandal without any success. But now, ironically enough, yesterday, the Wochenzeitung, the WOZ, published a 2-page article, which I recommend you very much to read, because you will also see there how wrong the argument of the 1860s is. How many voices, how many people, how many men and women since the 16th century have condemned slavery for what it is, a crime against humanity. Swiss government will have a third chance because Samira Marti from Basel-Land has submitted another private member's move. That was case 5, the Swiss government and slavery. No Nigerian has been automatically been suspected to be a drug dealer by the police. No indigenous woman has been discriminated against by an employer. No person of color insulted by a seemingly innocent Facebook post. But a gigantic crime against humanity has been justified, excused, and banalized by the Swiss government of 1864, and the government has been excused by the Swiss government of today. If that is not racism, then what else? Thanks very much for listening to me.
Wow. Thank you, Hans, for laying out those 5 cases in the way that you did, and then also bringing it to current times. And I'm still just shocked. Even, as a researcher, we look at these certain instances or historical events, but it's still amazing in the way that you concluded every case and saying, the police didn't arrest anyone, but ultimately this is racism and there is complicity from Switzerland with these discriminatory ties. I'm shocked. I'm sure our audience is a bit surprised, but before we get into talking about that deeper, I already see some questions coming up about that. I want to transition and really highlight Yvonne and hear your perspective, Yvonne. on really what is the current situation. I mean, given what Hans says, what's the current situation for people of African descent and other people of color in Switzerland? And then what actions are really being taken to combat this racism and ethnic discrimination?
Thank you, Christian. Yes, Hans's talk was really quite moving, and it left me also, although I've had it before, it always manages to take me to a place where I'm willing just to fight everybody. Okay, but yeah, so I'm going to try and explain the racism in Switzerland from a completely different angle, so that you can understand where we are right now, and also some of the, I would say, coping mechanisms that people of African descent have used or are trying to use to deal with the situation we have in Switzerland. Because as it is, there is, in 2018, there was a record of 100,000 people of African descent in Switzerland. And that was 2018. And you have to bear in mind also that Switzerland doesn't really keep records of people, the population, based on their ethnical background. So that's as close as we got to knowing how many people of African descent are in Switzerland. And I'm going to specifically talk about people of African descent because, one, I am a person of African descent, and two, they're on the hierarchical level found at the bottom of the whole ladder. So if you want to talk about racism and what goes on and who suffer the brunt of racism in this country, you would then have to use people of African descent as an example. It was just after the Second World War that Switzerland really got into trying to make and find out what they could use to make it a stronger country. And some of the things they needed was like a financial capital, social capital, and cultural capital. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the social cultural capital. Social cultural capital in this case, when I'm talking about it, I'm referring actually just to culture. Yeah. So the pro-Helvetia, just after the Second World War, decided to give some money to for the Swiss people to invest in what they decided would be the main national representations of their culture. That would be like investing in yodeling clubs, investing in wrestling clubs or swinger clubs, like they call it, investing in alcone clubs, investing in carnivals, and all sorts, those kind of things that would represent the Swiss culture. So there are varieties of intangible cultural heritage, like we would like to call them, according to the UNESCO. And in Switzerland, some of these, like I already said, are national wrestling festivals, municipal carnivals, parades of masked and costumed people, yodeling, alcone clubs, stone throwing festivals, just to mention a few. And these depict the intrinsic social cultural capital, like I said, of this country. And this social cultural capital help people move. They're social mobilizers, and they can help you move from one level of the society to another. Now, customs, like all other components of culture and or communal identity, they have a dual purpose. They bring a group together because they share a kind of shared experience or a journey and active participation. They also share some kind of observations. They share languages and all these kind of things. But culture and customs also serve to exclude certain people and individuals, certain groups. Now, they serve to say who belongs and who does not belong. They define and they agree on the context of who belong, and this is in the context of tradition, both in a symbolic and in a practical way, a pragmatical way. So belonging to a group, a place, a valley, or a country is a highly contested thing. It's not tangible, and it's therefore constantly being renegotiated through customs. Now, these fierce debates are about drawing boundaries between us and them or the other, and they reveal really deep and dangerous longings for belonging and cultural hegemony. The fear of the other influences how other people perceive you, perceive the other people. It influences how they treat those they perceive to be the other and how they view this other group. It influences the way they decide who belongs to an in-group and who belongs to an out-group. In Switzerland, these debates led to what we call the Schwarzenbach Initiative that was in 1970. And this initiative was basically about controlling how many foreigners are in Switzerland. And it lost, thank God, by a really small margin. 46% of the Swiss inhabitants voted for it. Yeah. So when you think about that, you can see how small the margin is by which it lost. So this lost in 1970, but it was again resubmitted 3 consecutive times, in 1974, in 1977, and in 1988. And it was even more radical when they submitted it those other times, because then they were asking that the number of foreigners in Switzerland be reduced to half, about half the number. So you can imagine they were actually asking for half of the foreigners who were working here, earning money for them, to be asked to pack their bags and just leave the country. You know, it didn't matter how long these people have been living here. This is just a small insight into this kind of fear they have of what they call the other or foreign people. This phenomenon of othering was also documented by the Working Group of Experts of People of African Descent, which, as Christian mentioned before, were here in January. They were here in January, and they usually work in different countries, and they usually oversee, they study the problems of racial discriminations of individuals of African descent worldwide. During their visit in January, the Working Group of People of African Descent, they made a press release just depicting what they had seen. And in their press release, they also had some few recommendations about what can be done about what they had seen. But they also, in this press release specifically mentioned and underlined the racial stereotypes or othering that we have that are really omnipresent in Switzerland. The people of African descent, the Working Group of People of African Descent stated that people of African descent in Switzerland are othered and are perceived as foreigners, regardless of whether they are first generation, second generation, or even third generation in Switzerland. These stereotypes are forced upon them in different sections in ways, in a way of maintaining the race disparities that are present in Switzerland. Examples of some of these stereotypes were found in the educational sector. For example, where the youths were exposed to gatekeeping tactics and racial tropes that alluded to their incompetence. In the medical field, women of African descent specifically were exposed to the racial trope of the strong Black woman, where their pain their physical and mental pain was constantly ignored, and they were always wrongly diagnosed. Another encounter where you would find some of the stereotypes rampant in Switzerland is with the encounters with the police. With the police, we see the stereotype or the trope of the male drug dealer and the female sex worker attributed to people of African descent, with no possibility to include or to improve, the racial disparities and the constant exposing to othering. Migrant communities have developed various coping mechanisms as survival tactics. I will use a personal example now to try and show you some of the coping mechanisms we have developed to deal with discrimination, prejudice. I went through a difficult time 3 years after I was in Switzerland of constantly feeling unwelcome and not being included and being discriminated against. So in desperation, I well, thought to myself, looked down and decided, how am I going to be able to deal with this situation? How am I going to be able to cope with this situation? I needed to find a way of dealing with it because I couldn't speak German at that time. So language was not really going to be one of the social capitals I would use, although I already didn't have enough social capital. So in desperation, I remember the saying in my mother tongue, Luo, which says, if you want somebody to give you complete undivided attention, like most of you who have tuned in now are doing to me, then you need to speak to them in their mother tongue. Now, considering I didn't speak any German at that time, I decided to just loosely translate mother tongue to mean something I could already do. Now, as a little girl, I grew up in a household where we would sing in the choir, gospel, jazz, blues. So I decided to translate language in this content to mean singing because that was something I could do. So I decided to Google, went into on my computer, Google Swiss traditional music, St. Gallen, which is where I used to live. And the first address that came up, I wrote to the guy and said, hey, I would like to learn how to yodel because that was the Swiss traditional music that came up because it might help me find a coping mechanism. It might help me save my marriage and save my life at the moment in Switzerland. So luckily, I got in touch with the right person. He replied, and I was able to find a yodel teacher who taught me how to yodel. And after some time, not too long after I had started learning how to yodel, he started taking me to gigs with his group. So there I saw Switzerland through a completely different light, through a different side of Switzerland that made me convinced that I could actually survive here. You know, that was a kind of coping mechanism I used. Now, when I say I learned how to yodel, most people really would not be able to understand or to picture me as somebody who can yodel. So the fact that I used the Swiss culture, the fact that I was able to get in touch with a yodel teacher who fueled my curiosity for the Swiss culture was actually a positive for me. But not everybody has this kind of opportunity to learn how to yodel. My need for learning the Swiss culture was fueled and actually encouraged by the person I got to know, and they opened a different door, not just in yodeling. They taught me more about the Swiss culture. I learned more about the different kind of traditions I mentioned before, because like here you see, I attended the Onshpung Fest, which is the stone throwing festival in 2017 in Interlaken, where they have a stone that is about 83 kilos or a little bit more, maybe 83 and 5 kilos, which people usually throw. They lift it up and they actually throw it as a part of a sport. They've been doing this for the last 200 years, and it's done every 12 years. So the next one is going to be in 2029. What you're seeing right now actually is just a copy. It is not the real one because I wouldn't be able to throw a stone that is actually 83 kilos and a half. But they had a replica, and that is the one I decided that I wanted to try out. But so I began attending yodeling classes, like I said, and this had a positive effect on me. And in my case, I decided to learn the Swiss culture and continue doing so by adapting aspects of the Swiss culture while maintaining my African culture. This equal balancing of both cultures without letting one of them be dominant was only possible in my case because I had a very strong positive ethnic identity, which worked as a buffer, and I was able to balance both of them. So I ended up acculturizing instead of actually assimilating into the Swiss culture. The acculturalization helped me achieve my sense of belonging, which is mostly what most migrants here try to look for when they come here and they try to adapt and try to learn the Swiss culture. With time, I got to know and to witness other people of African descent in the cultural scene who also went through similar processes of acculturation with the Swiss, within the Swiss national wrestling sport, for example, because this one is similar to a Senegalese national wrestling sport. And in Senegal, it's called lam. In Switzerland, it's called schwingen. And I got to know, at least now, I know about 4 people of African descent who engage in this sport. Here is the latest one I got to know. He's a 16-year-old who recently won quite a lot of titles in the Federal Youth Wrestling Day. Those are some of the prizes they won. He won this cow in the Federal Youth Wrestling Day, and it reminded me quite a bit of some of the prizes we also win, especially like in Senegal, when they do the wrestling, they also win animals, sometimes goats, sheep, cow, it depends on what they have there. So it reminded me a lot of the similarities of our cultures, because also in Kenya, we have the Maasai tribe that has a kind of yodeling technique they use for their music, which is just moving from your head to your chest voice. Now, this acculturation has not been easy. I spoke to some of the people I know who have used the same coping mechanism. It has not been easy for any of us because we have to deal with a lot of gatekeepers, Swiss people who have a hard time accepting people of color in their traditional white spaces and act as gatekeepers because they don't understand why you would want to learn the Swiss traditional culture. I will show you another example of how during one of the times when I was doing yodeling, I went through a kind of subtle, it's an unconscious bias, because in this case, the people I asked to yodel with me did not even know why they were reacting to me the way they were reacting to me.
Min vader ist ein Appenzoller. Noch einmal.
Du hast doch noch eine Bremen am Bein. Wie viel Studenten genau drauf?
3.
Ah, 3 halt.
Ja. Okay. Okay, wir versuchen. Mein Vater ist ein Appenzoller.
Er heeft de gas met something.
Now, like I mentioned before, we all develop different coping mechanisms for what we go through. Some of them are positive, some of them are not positive. Like assimilation is also one of the coping mechanisms people of African descent use to deal with racism. In assimilation, the people of African descent who go through this actually give up the other part of the, I would say, the less dominant culture. And normally that is usually the African culture. And they go through stages of what I would call passing. And this usually happens to people of African descent who are much lighter skinned than I am, because they have the ability, they have the proximity to whiteness because they are much lighter skinned. So they decide to pass for being white. That means they completely deny the African side of them. They dissociate themselves with their culture in an effort to actually try to fit in an effort to survive. Another way people usually try to cope with racism is just separating themselves completely from the Swiss culture, segregating themselves completely from the Swiss culture. And this is usually done, especially by people of African descent who are dealing with their history, the trauma of racial discrimination through a way of trying to confront it with anger. So that they do not actually attack people or are not so confrontational, although they are sometimes, they do challenge anybody who approaches them with racism. They decide to kind of separate themselves. So you find different groups of different ethnicities who decide they do not really want to mix with the Swiss culture. That is also another way of coping with these mechanisms. The working group of people of African descent did give a series of recommendations which they thought should be used to try and help people of African descent deal with racism. But these recommendations were not only to help people of African descent deal with racism, but also to help the Swiss people deal with their internalized racism as well. Some of these recommendations were, for example, in the medical field, they gave a recommendation that they should have, Switzerland should have more people trained in the medical field to deal with people of African descent. And in the educational field, they also recommended that we should have people of African descent, more people of African descent trained and taught in the educational field as professors, as teachers in primary schools, and so on. The same recommendation I would also give, and they also gave, for, I would say, the police and the jurisdiction, because we have an underrepresentation of people of African descent in very meaningful and top-tier job areas, or areas where actually it would make quite a lot of sense to have people of African descent. I will stop my talk here and we will proceed with whatever questions you have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yvonne, for that riveting piece and showing how you coped and enculturated yourself through yodeling. With the time we have left, I want to pass the mic to my colleague, Nicole, and she will cover any questions in the chat.
Thank you, Christian. Yeah, let's make best use of the time that is left. And I'd like to first address two questions to Hans. I think they can go nicely together. One person would like to know again the 5 titles of your cases that you gave. So it would be good if you could repeat them slowly. And the second question was really concerning the Swiss government case, the reparation payments. There was a question in the sense of what kind of legal ground would have been needed, you know, that the reparations would have been paid.
Okay, can everybody hear me? Because my picture in the camera is frozen, but that doesn't matter. So the 5 cases I mentioned were first Haiti. So Haiti is demanding restitution of this ransom sum that they had to pay to France, and Switzerland could have helped Haiti in that case. The second was the Swiss Academy of Sciences. Today it's best known as SCNAT. That's the short form they use, but it was die Schweizerische Naturforschende Gesellschaft when it was founded. They took a very long time to join us in the fight to rename Agassiz Promontory on the Moon, and when the International Astronomical Union refused, they said it was okay for them. They accepted it and the matter was closed. Third case, reparations for slavery. I think Switzerland should pay reparations for slavery. Maybe not the canton of Bern alone, because I think this would be a matter for the federal government. Number 4 was Switzerland's self-image. How much of Swiss wealth is based on slavery, on slaves' work or work of enslaved people. And the last one was the Swiss government's position on slavery in the 1860s. Was it normal? Was it okay? Was it acceptable? Or was it a crime then already? Because as most historians, legal experts, and philosophers would say, it has always been a crime, but it took white people a few centuries to accept that. The question of a legal basis for reparations is quite complex. I'm not a lawyer, but I would simply say this: if there is no legal basis, then we ought to make one. In the case of compensations for Verdingkinder, for child slavery, there was no law. So Swiss Parliament worked on an act of Parliament and decided that according to this law, this act of Parliament, compensation payments had to be made. And first they thought that this was quite easy, but then they found out it was actually more complicated than they had thought. So they had to amend this first law because they had found that people who got compensation payments, they were moving ahead in their tax payment structure. So they ended up by having less money than before. So they had to change that again. So even if it's complicated, it must be done. And on a global basis, I think it's again quite complex, but if the United Nations or if European nations or if the EU wants to do something about it, they can do that. If there is a problem, we make a law. And if there is a moral obligation, even more so.
Yes, yes. Thank you very much, Hans. I think we have time left for a last question. This goes to Yvonne. How can we, as a Swiss uni, I think talking really not only for University of St. Gallen, for many others as well, how can we help people of African descent integrate, acculturate more?
Well, the thing is, what we experience at the moment in the Swiss culture is that although it looks like it's really, really diverse, and it is, because we have, 4 different languages in this country. So it doesn't get more diverse than that in no other country that I know, 4 different national languages. And the Swiss culture has so much richness in it. And a lot of us, first, second, and third generation, are actually interested in learning this culture. But every time we try, we are faced with all these roadblocks, all these gatekeepers, and it takes a lot of willpower to just try and stick to it. For example, nobody wants you to simply learn. You have to do a lot of research to find out what does it mean with the different traditional dresses. The fact that one wears something on their hair that is white and one wears that is black, what does it mean, the difference? What does it mean in Zurich, for example, when you wear a blue traditional track instead of a colorful one? They have all these different meanings, and we are interested in it. We would like this exchange of knowledge, but we keep meeting roadblocks because most of these associations, which are funded by the Pro Helvetia, act as gatekeepers, and they're the ones who decide. They have the rules. They decide who joins a club, who doesn't join a club. And at the moment, it's very tricky to join a club. It's very tricky to learn the culture if you don't join the club. I have been able to join maybe 2 yodeling clubs in Schlieren here, where I am, and one in Dietikon, but it took a lot of time, and I only managed because they knew about me before, and I'm kind of persistent. So I would say, if you had a way of teaching the Swiss culture, I see Hans smiling, if you had a way of teaching the Swiss culture in a way that was more accessible to those who were interested in it, without having all these barriers, because I think a lot of people who are the gatekeepers, they think if they let foreigners in, it will dilute the culture. They don't understand that culture is actually an ever-changing thing, and identity is, according to me, something that is also always changing with every person, and it is not what people put on you that is your identity, but actually what you yourself construct that is your identity. I hope I answered the question.
Yes, yes, Yvonne, thank you very much for this very, good explanation of where this room for improvement. We have a couple of more questions, but we are actually at the end of the session's time. So I'd like to stop here, and I would be very, very happy if I could, Hans and Yvonne, ask you to check the chat that is on LinkedIn and go there and provide your feedback on those very interesting questions that are still out there. And like this, I'm hoping we can continue the conversation. And I'm sure both of you will get many other individual reactions and questions from the audience. But having said this, I would hand over back to you, Christian, for the closing of the session.
Thanks, Nicole, and thank you, everyone. As our time concludes, I'd like to especially thank both Yvonne and Hans for their work and support. What you do is not an easy task, and we truly appreciate you. Thank you, Nicole, as well. Thank you, Aida, who's behind the scenes making sure that you can see us on camera today. So it is a team effort combating racism, discrimination, and creating a more fair, just, and equitable society. If you are looking to continue this fight and for more support, contact us at the CCDI. You can follow us on LinkedIn. You can check out our website. For tours, you can contact Hans at lovatour.ch and ultimately support Yvonne in her work on all levels because she is phenomenal. And I would like to remind you that we have 2 more sessions to come in this year's deep dives. 2 years after George Floyd, the impact on businesses on June 29th, and then a more equitable Switzerland. What can organizations do on August 24th? With that said, I'm Christian Pierce from the CCDI at the University of St. Gallen. Have a phenomenal day and a great weekend. Thank you again.